Building off of this presentation, our next session will feature a panel discussion with 3 subject matter experts to explore pre-market adverse event grouping. I will pass it back to Scott from the FDA team, who will serve as the moderator for the panel. Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Marianne. In this panel session, we will focus on best practices and emerging technologies to identify and categorize adverse events, while also providing feedback about the FMQs and how approaches to grouping safety events, including FMQs, may be included in drug labeling. So the panelists have already been introduced. What I'd like to do now is they do have a statement that each of them would like to present. And we'll start with Ellis Unger, who will provide some opening remarks. Ellis?
Sorry, I'll start over. Thank you very much, Scott. Anytime I give a presentation, I start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. But I have to say, for this symposium, I'm really delighted to be here because this is a subject that's been near and dear to my heart for many years. I retired from FDA a year ago. I've been doing consulting, but for 24 years out of the last 25, I was at FDA, and I was doing safety analyses of NDAs. And so this is something I think that's critically important, and I'm just delighted to see the fruition of your work now out in the public. So next slide. I don't really have any conflicts to report. Next slide. So why do we collect safety data? Well, Peter Stein went through this in real detail, but basically we want to understand what drugs do and be able to communicate this information in labeling. And obviously the safety data help us make benefit risk assessments and help to make regulatory decisions. Next slide. So the current state of affairs is like this. Subjects come and see investigators at predefined intervals. And the investigator says, hey, how have you been doing the last 3 months? And if there was an adverse event, then they have to record it. And the investigators record this. A lot of times they use medical shorthand, like fall with our hip FX, which would be a right hip fracture. And they record that. But those terms obviously can't be analyzed because they need to be put into kind of a standard language that a computer can decipher. And so those verbatim terms are translated into these standard preferred terms. And there are over 20,000 of these. And I think the 1,000 people on the call understand this pretty well, but at any rate, then the preferred terms are tabulated, and there are various approaches to do this. Companies may or may not perform MEDRA queries, standard MEDRA queries, and often they do queries of their own composition on adverse events of special interest, and that's pretty common. Next slide. The problem, as several people have said, is that essentially identical preferred terms are reported separately. So, here you have a lot of flavors of respiratory tract infection. Some are upper, some are lower, some are called viral, some are not. You have to think about how these data are collected. You've got an investigator who, may or may not even pretend to use a stethoscope, who may or may not have the patient in front of them when they had this, infection, because the patient could be reporting what happened to them a month ago. And so these terms are obviously the same. There's no difference between them. And if you separate them, then basically you distort the safety data. You divide it up so that it's unusable. Next slide. It's not only rather, uninteresting and unimportant terms, but some really, really critical terms can be reported separately. Like, you always want to know if a drug causes heart failure. And yet all these terms, which all mean heart failure, they're functionally the same, they're separated, unless it happened to be an adverse event of special interest, or unless someone runs a standard MEDRA query on it. Next slide. And, this is a real head scratcher. So here's pulmonary edema. This is from some real application from some time in the last 24 years. Why would you separate pulmonary edema from, next slide, acute pulmonary edema? I mean, they're the same because not patients, patients don't walk around with chronic pulmonary edema. Pulmonary edema is generally acute. So one should not separate acute pulmonary edema from pulmonary edema. Next slide. And amazingly, some preferred terms with essentially identical meaning are split across system organ classes. So acute pulmonary edema and pulmonary edema, what I just showed you, they're a respiratory system organ class, whereas cardiac failure are in the cardiac disorders system organ class, and yet they all mean heart failure. So they're separated in different stocks. Well, it's crazy. So I became aware of this when I was doing one of my very first application reviews in 2000, I think, and I just scratched my head, and I recognized that when all these terms are separated, that the analyses that are done by the company, with the terms separated, they're either splayed over hundreds of pages of SAS output, or they tabulate the things that they do query, but they often don't query things that I would query, like, for example, heart failure. And those pages and pages of SAS output, where every adverse event, every preferred term gets a line, is mind-numbing. It's not really useful. Nobody can review that. Fortunately, we have the data files, so we can do this. We, the FDA or industry, you can do this, yourselves. Next slide. The other problem that comes up all the time is that the investigations system organ class comes up and says, okay, your blood potassium is increased. That's an investigation. But hyperkalemia is a syndrome, so that's in the metabolism and nutrition disorders. Well, that's fine, but they mean the same thing. And whether you call it hyperkalemia or blood potassium increased, if you want to know whether a drug increases potassium, you certainly want to combine those. Next. So the problem is that some companies don't run any adverse event queries at all. And even if they are run for adverse events of special interest, they're generally not run for adverse events that are not designated adverse events of special interest. And then when similar related preferred terms are reported only separately, various important, adverse drug reactions can go undetected. You saw the example that I think Vaishali showed about anxiety. So many will not make the threshold, whatever that is, 2%, 5%, because they're separated. And as I think Eric mentioned, you can have times where there's a signal that shows up, but if you'd actually combined all the terms, then the signal wouldn't even be there. Next slide. So an interim solution, which was not ideal, but I did it, is that when I was a medical officer, there were always things I wanted to know about. I wanted to know if a drug caused heart failure, arrhythmias, renal dysfunction, falls, fractures, all those things in that list. I just had to know whether they were adverse events of special interest, whether there was any non-clinical data supporting them. How can you not look to see if a drug, if there's a difference in pneumonia? You have to look. So I started piecing together my own queries and developed probably 300 or 400 of them and ran them myself. And I based my safety reviews on these analyses, and they weren't perfect. I mean, there may have been 50 to 100 terms for pneumonia, and maybe I wasn't correct about all of them, but I never wanted to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so they seemed fit for purpose. And I would run them and then share them with the applicant and say, look, this is what I found, let's talk about it. And it worked out pretty well. But it wasn't the best solution. I mean, the FDA really needed to move forward and do this. Next slide. Vaishali mentioned there are some issues with the MEDRA standard queries. If you look at their website, it says FMQs are tools developed to facilitate retrieval of MEDRA-coded data as a first step in investigating drug safety issues in pharmacovigilance and clinical development. So a lot of their use is for pharmacovigilance, and not all of it's for clinical development. The queries weren't put together by people who do nothing but safety reviews of new drugs day in and day out. Next slide. The solution, is again the FDA MEDRA queries, And again, my hat is really off to all of you for doing this and getting it out there. Some 80 medical officers have been involved. I mean, I can remember, 27 emails about, what do you think about depression versus suicidality versus suicide? Where do these belong? And, you go back and forth to people in psychiatry who actually knew the answers. And that's how a lot of this work was hammered out. And an immense amount of credit is due to this group of people. The amount of expertise brought to bear is truly impressive. And my hope is that broader use of these will be an important advance in safety assessment and drug labeling. And hopefully everybody will be able to run these. I used to run them in Excel. Now I can run them in Jump in very, very little time. It's very easy. And now that they're out on the web, I think anybody should be able to do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellis. That was very informative, and it's great to see you again. The next speaker is Dr. Greg Ball, who is head of safety statistics at Novavax and also co-leads the FMQs Safety Analytics Working Group. Greg?
Thanks, Scott. I'm so excited to be here at this point in time when all of these forces are coming together to help us improve how we evaluate, assess, and communicate important safety information. So I'm going to talk about the technology that's needed here. But at this ground level of the new construction, it's not the methodology so much. It's more the infrastructure, the framework, and the multidisciplinary processes that are necessary. So I'm going to be talking about the ecosystem for these FMQs and also the standard safety tables and figures. Next slide, please. So we've been reimagining how to do a safety submission. There's a lot of project teams in this arena working together, although not always coordinated. A couple of years ago, we started a safety graphics consortium. So this is a loose affiliation of teams relevant to safety graphics that are networking together, because no team can span the whole space, but together we can build a network that spans this space. And here are 4 of those groups, 2 from FMQs, the safety analytics and the data visualization working groups, and from DAYS, to joint collaboration between DIA communities and the ASA Biopharm, interdisciplinary safety evaluation scientific working group. There's a couple project teams from there, interactive safety graphics. Jeremy will talk about that in the next session. And aggregate safety assessment planning, Barbara will talk about in this session here. But we took advantage of the FMQs community forums, where groups within FMQs and outside of FMQs can come together and have a forum and develop these ideas. So we've been reimagining a safety submission. Next slide, please. And to provide a little motivation here is a quote from John Tukey. Far better, and you probably heard this, especially if you're a statistician, but even if you're not, far better an approximate answer to the right question, which is often vague, than an exact answer to the wrong question, which can always be made precise. So here, the exact answer is an efficacy analysis, right? So this is back in 62, 10 years or so after randomization was introduced into clinical trials. And already we're developing the most powerful tests, which is great for efficacy, but that's a different thing. And we've been talking about this for a long time, at least as far back as 1962. The wrong question is a safety assessment, right? There's subgroups, there's dose response, there's other clinical consideration. You have to understand the safety data in order to do a proper safety assessment. Next slide, please. And we move forward, and still we're struggling with these issues here. Bob O'Neill back in 1995, about the time that ICH was moving forward here, he identified the imbalance between safety assessments and efficacy analyses, and that they could benefit from not just quantitative people working with subject matter experts, but also industry stakeholders working with our regulatory partners and people from academia. Next slide, please. So more recently, there's a great quote from Jacqueline Corrigan-Correa from the FDA, where she really encapsulates the way FDA thinks about aggregate safety assessments. The important thing is to have a thoughtful process, a system in place to look for clinically important imbalances, applying the best clinical and quantitative judgment while maintaining trial integrity. Next slide. So that is very eloquent. I think it really does capture the spirit of the IND safety reporting final rule, and more generally aggregate safety assessments. In conjunction with that, we published a paper recently demonstrating the alignment between industry and FDA on this philosophy. This is not as eloquent, but it helps us to operationalize this idea that aggregate safety assessments should be a multidisciplinary approach. Assessment should be customized for the specific product. We need quantitative frameworks for measuring evidence of association, but decisions must incorporate medical judgment. Next slide, please. And to illustrate this, I'm using an example outside of the pharma industry. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. At the time the decision was made to launch, looking at the quantitative data, that supported the decision to launch the space shuttle. What some people may not know is that there was other important information that the engineers presented, but it was not quantitative. So the managers didn't accept it. They didn't, it didn't fit into their way of thinking. They couldn't use the non-quantitative information. There was an engineer who introduced some information, a couple observations. There was a failure of an O-ring in a flight that occurred in 75-degree temperature. And then there was a second failure of an O-ring in 53-degree temperature. And all he could describe was that in the higher temperature, there was a very thin streak of light gray soot beyond an O-ring in the joint. In the colder temperature, there was jet black soot fanned out across a large swath of the joint, but he couldn't quantify it. So they didn't use this information, and you know what happened. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do? We need to reimagine how we think about safety assessments, moving from, for example, a three-tiered approach, which adheres to an efficacy mindset, a testing and confirming kind of approach, where tier 1 and tier 2 is distinguished by p-values, and tier 2 and tier 3 are separated by often the rule of 4, which is just means that if you have fewer than 4 events, you can't exclude 0 from the confidence interval. Well, that's just a mathematical artifact. It doesn't really say anything about the clinical significance of these events. So we're moving to a two-part approach, where in part 1, we look at everything because you can't not look at something in safety. Something unexpected could emerge. And part 2, for decision-making, we focus on safety topics of interest, and we look at these more closely. And we only use p-values the way they're designed to be used with hypothesis tests. So have one or a small number of p-values. Next slide, please. So recently we formed the Aegis project team in FMQs, which stands for AE groupings and safety. And has been well documented by speakers before me, AEs that are too specific can result in underestimation of an event. So we formed this project team to develop points to consider when deciding whether to use a meta-defined grouping. I use the language we used before FMQs were introduced here, although they are meta-defined groupings, versus creating a custom grouping, and to provide recommendations on the process implementation. So going forward, right, this is not a stagnant collection of terms here. This is a living ecosystem, and these FMQs are going to, our knowledge is going to evolve over time. So now we have a collection of terms. When we implement them, they will work very well, but there's going to be learning. So they're going to be adjusted as time goes on, just like the MEDRA does with their groupings. But there's going to be programs, maybe in a new population, a new medical entity, and there's going to be safety topics of interest that are not encompassed by one of these FMQs, and teams will need to be able to develop their own. Now, if it becomes more useful, not just in that project, but in other projects in that class or in that therapeutic area or across therapeutic areas, maybe a new FMQ will develop from that. And I want to put a little advertisement in here. The Fuse is having the CSS next week, where Vaishali is going to present on these new FMQs and also on the standard safety tables and figures. Next slide, please. Also, DAYS has a project team on the aggregate safety assessment planning process. So this is a way of planning and coordinating all of the aggregate reviews of safety data that you need to understand the safety profile. And it is focused on those safety topics of interest, which could be FMQs, for example, and also the pooling strategy for characterizing the emerging safety profile. And then these are used in the planning and execution of ongoing aggregate safety evaluations, leading to the regulatory filing activities, and also beyond that in post-marketing. This would continue to consistently and authoritatively communicate the safety story in scientific evaluations and public disclosures. Next slide, please. So here's the ecosystem. We have now FEA medical queries and standard safety tables and figures, helping us to consistently and authoritatively communicate the safety story. Leading up to that, we have the aggregate safety assessment planning process, where we plan and coordinate all of the aggregate reviews of safety data focused on these safety topics of interest defined by FMQs. And we have the Fuse Aegis group, which is helping us to coordinate how we use these FMQs and creating other groupings that are needed for particular programs. And these are going to be learned about through interactive safety graphics, which Jeremy Wildfire is going to talk about in the next session. But all of these groups working together to improve how we evaluate, assess, and communicate important safety information. And one more slide, please. So John Tukey, who I used a quote from before to motivate us, he worked very closely for many years with Joe Hayes at Merck. And Joe was my mentor for a time. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. But he introduced me to this book, and I put it in here so people can see it, and hopefully go get that book and read it, because it'll help you to reimagine how we need to do aggregate safety assessments. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, for inviting me to make remarks today regarding aggregate safety assessment planning and clinical development. Next slide. This is my disclaimer slide. Next slide. I'm presenting today on behalf of the Aggregate Safety Assessment Planning Task Force, which is one of multiple task forces that are a joint collaboration between the Drug Information Association communities and the American Statistical Association Biopharma Group. The ASA Biopharma Safety Working Groups are an official public-private partnership with US FDA. Our task force last year published a template for aggregate safety assessment planning, which is an internal document that guides sponsor teams in clinical development and promotes multidisciplinary safety planning to ensure data gathered will answer the key questions from healthcare prescribers, health authorities, as well as patients. And I've provided the reference below for the TIERS manuscript that was published last year. Next slide. So important features of the aggregate safety assessment plan are to promote proactive safety planning, including specifying the safety topics of interest and relevant event search criteria, supporting systematic characterization of the emerging product safety profile, driving consistency in collection and assessment of the safety data across the program. Also, there's a section of the ASAP which describes ongoing signal detection and evaluation activities, which helps facilitate earlier recognition of safety knowledge gaps, and prepare for safety communications and regulatory submissions. Next slide. So what are the safety topics of interest? These are events for which something more than routine is being done in regards to data collection or data analysis. And typically safety topics of interest have the potential to impact the product's benefit risk profile and include important identified risks, important potential risks, and other safety topics of interest. These safety topics of interest may come from multiple sources, including product clinical trial data, preclinical findings or reported risks of products of the same class, theoretical concerns based on the product's mechanism of action, and other safety topics of interest may emerge from traditional regulatory concerns like drug-induced liver injury, or events of high interest based on epidemiology of the patient population, which at the start of the clinical trial program, there may be no reason to believe that the product has any causal association, but it's expected that you will see these events during the course of clinical development. Next slide. So in the ASAP manuscript, we suggest a table such as this be developed for the safety topics of interest, which speaks to what data is being collected and analyzed during the course of the program. And you'll see the third column of this table. There's a place to denote how the safety topics of interest are being identified. And for this hypothetical immunomodulatory product, herpes zoster is a safety topic of interest. Next slide. So during the course of populating this table in the ASAP, the safety management team realizes there is no standardized metric query for herpes zoster, the medical concept of which is reflected by multiple metric preferred terms. So they realize that they need to create a novel PT grouping so that there'll be a uniform approach to identifying these events across the program. Next slide. So in developing new metric queries to assess product data, several aspects have to be kept in mind. First, it's very important to define the medical concept of interest. Then the team should review the relevant medical literature and look to see if there's any other event queries that have been published which may be appropriate in this particular case. And now we have the FDA metric queries as one of those examples that we look to finding such event queries that may be appropriate. If there isn't an appropriate medical meta event query that's already been established, then the team may have to develop one on their own. And it's very critical that the inclusion and exclusion criteria or guiding principles for the PT grouping be delineated. Then which preferred terms are included or excluded should be confirmed with subject matter experts. And after the standardized PT grouping is finalized, then the team needs to develop a process for assessing the impact of any MEDRA upgrades on the PT grouping that's been developed. Next slide. So I've talked a bit about the safety topics of interest, and those in the ASAP have pre-specified data analyses to be done. However, the ASAP really is covering the totality of the clinical trial safety data. So additional events that may not be covered under the safety topic of interest, including laboratory evaluations, vital sign measurements, ECG assessments, other types of safety data. So it's very important that all of this data is systematically during the course of the ongoing clinical trials be evaluated for any novel safety signals, which may not have been designated as safety topics of interest at the start of the clinical development program. Next slide. So these delineated aggregate analyses help identify events for which there is evidence to conclude a causal association with the product. In addition, the ASAP facilitates further characterization of the identified and potential risks and specifies the MEDRA PT groupings used to calculate event rates as well as for signal detection purposes, as I mentioned earlier. And search criteria to identify events for rate calculations, for example, in labeling, may become narrower than what is used at the beginning of the program for signal detection, as the nature of the adverse reaction is better understood. Also, the ASAP describes how the occurrence of expected adverse reactions will be monitored in future clinical trials, for example, in novel patient populations, to determine if the rate is higher than that noted in the current safety reference information. Next slide. So in conclusion, the ASAP is a guide for methodical safety planning, data generation, risk assessment, and communications, and alignment on the safety topics of interest. It's proactively developed by multidisciplinary clinical trial sponsor safety management teams, and it promotes systematic evaluation of the safety data from ongoing clinical trials, as well as earlier signal detection. ASAP really lays the foundation for the future integrated summary of safety and the determination of the risks of the product, and including adverse reactions. Also, the ASAP facilitates earlier recognition of safety knowledge gaps that need to be addressed in the future. That's the conclusion of my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barbara. And thank you to all of the panelists for your opening comments. So what we're going to do now is jump into the discussion questions, and perhaps Alice and Barbara, if you can turn your cameras on and we can see you. So I did want to start with just clarifying questions to make sure that we're all on the same page. Were there any, based on the opening talks or the panelists' comments, any things that were not clear? So not so much if you disagreed with them, but anything that, any definitions of terms or things that were not clear to you, just so that we make sure that we're all on the same page. I'll just open that up to all the panelists.
I think it's very clear.
All right.
I do want to say that I'm especially excited about these algorithmic FMQs. I think that's a really new idea and is potentially very powerful.
Thank you. And Alice and Barbara, any clarifying questions?
Well, I mean, I've been doing this for many years, so I understand it, but you know, it might be worth looking at the Q&As and seeing if there are any predominant misunderstandings from the audience. But well, I thought it was clear.
Okay. And Barbara?
I thought the overall presentations were clear. I think that when you get down to individual FMQs and your algorithms and how you're translating that into labeling in the future, I can see where there may be questions about specific data sets and how you translate what's in your particular data set into the approach that you've
Okay. Well, we'll spend some time on that. We did receive a number of questions about, why not SMQs or the measure hierarchy? I know Ellis has weighed in on that, and we'll still give him a chance to speak more. But Barbara, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share about those groupings and how FMQs compare? Or any thoughts?
Well, I did see a lot of questions in the Q&A about when to use the MEDRA SMQs, especially the narrow ones. I think we've used those frequently versus the FDA MEDRA queries. And also a lot of the submissions that many companies do are global submissions. And so, you know, a lot of the health authorities that are not, that are ex-US may not be familiar as much going forward with the FDA MEDRA queries. And so, you know, I think I saw a number of questions about that in the chat.
And did you have any additional thoughts you wanted to share as far as your when one would use SMQs versus the hierarchy? May not be too fair to ask you about FMQs as you're seeing them for perhaps the first time ever. But any additional thoughts?
Well, I think you have to look at the medical concept that you're trying to do signal detection for, as well as once you get to the point that you're actually looking at what adverse reaction you're going to include in the label. I think part of the aggregate analyses and looking at the totality of the data should lead to understand exactly what the nature of the adverse reaction is that's associated with your particular drug. And then you have to look at which preferred term groupings best represents, you know, the adverse reaction that you feel is causally associated with product. And so, you know, and whether, you know, that's a narrow SMQ query grouping, or, you know, maybe one of these FDA MEDRA groupings, or maybe you do need to create a novel PT grouping in order to provide a calculated rate in the label that you think really represents accurately the adverse reaction you're seeing.
Thank you. And Greg?
Yeah, the issue I've experienced with standardized MEDRA queries, using them to come up define safety topics of interest, is that they tend to be too broad, even when using the narrow definition. So often companies would maybe start with an SMQ, but using clinical judgment, pare it down to what was relevant for that particular product. Or if the SMQ was too far from what was needed, just coming up with a completely customized group of terms. And the problem is that this is not standardized across the industry or even within that drug class oftentimes. And that complicates analyses. Like if you want to come up with a background rate and a different company used a different collection of terms, and you're trying to understand what you expect, but you don't really know exactly what they included, it really complicates our ability to compare what we expect with what we observe in ongoing clinical studies.
Thank you. And Ellis, I know you got to weigh in on this in your talk. Did you have any additional thoughts? Okay, I think Ellis has moved on, so maybe we'll be able to get him back. So getting back to the discussion questions, did want to talk about your experience at your own institutions with grouping events, and how does that compare? To what extent do you use SMQs versus the hierarchy, and to the extent that you're willing to weigh in on FMQs, what your thoughts are about that. Maybe I can start with Barbara.
Yes, we typically, in the safety topics of interest, our ASAP task force recommends that you pre-specifies for signal detection what you're using for event search criteria. And oftentimes it has been a narrow SMQ, but sometimes, if there is not one that's appropriate, you have to develop your own novel preferred term grouping. In the future, we may be able to use the FDA MEDRC queries that are available now. And I think, as Greg mentioned, that once you get to the point where you're really defining your adverse reactions, and hopefully through the totality of the data that's led you to consider this causally associated with product, you developed a good understanding of what the nature is of the event that's causally associated with the product. And then I agree with Greg, generally narrow SMQs at that point, even our reaction and calculate, you go to something more narrow.
Thank you. Alice, didn't know if you had any additional thoughts. I know you shared during your panel presentation issues you've had with other grouping strategies, but we did get quite a few questions about, well, why not SMQs? Why not the measure hierarchy? Did you have any additional thoughts you wanted to share about that?
Yeah, my internet has been unstable, so I'm walking around the room here. I went to my cell phone. Some of the SMQs I think are just wrong. I mean, just be honest. I don't pretend to be an expert in all of medicine, but for example, put orders is, first degree heart blocks, block, they aren't amazing. And so it says to me, do understand this is wrong. And it kind of concern other, were maybe expert, there are errors. And I've seen a number of examples where, line up very well with.
Okay, I'm sorry, Alice. It looks like we're losing you. Vishali, did you? I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi, Scott.
Hi.
Thank you. We have slides in the backup section to address some of the questions that are related to, whether or not HLT or HLGT from the MEDRA hierarchy can be used. So I know Alice and others have already given their opinion about the FMQs versus SMQs, but if we can show those couple of slides, maybe we can clearly, have a side-by-side comparison of FMQ versus HLT or HLGT. So I wonder if Duke Margolis' team can bring them up.
And while we're getting the slides, maybe I can continue an idea. I think Ellis was starting here. One big advantage of these FMQs, I mean, a lot of time and effort has gone in, and a lot of subject matter experts have studied the data from across the industry and come up with events that are very relevant for understanding the safety. So it's very pragmatically generated, very empirically generated. So these are real events that commonly are of interest in understanding the safety. So I think that's probably the greatest strength of FMQ for this specific purpose, as opposed to SMQs. And not that there's anything wrong with SMQs, but in defining safety topics of interest to help characterize the safety profile in labeling, FMQs are designed for that purpose.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. So Brian, if we can go to slide 46 or 47. Okay, great. So, here we talk about MEDRA hierarchy. So the MEDRA hierarchy combines PTs using multiple strategies like anatomy, pathology, physiology, right? And then there are also PTs that are not related to AE. So for example, there are indications, medical procedures, other characteristics. FMQs are more focused for only goal is to create clinically meaningful groupings. So they only group the adverse events. And can you go to the next slide, please? Right, so here's an example of the FMQ with HLT and HLGT side by side. So you can see that FMQs actually go across SOCs, while HLT and HLGT, they do follow that system organ class. So the example that Alice showed about pulmonary edema versus heart failure, heart failure will be mapped to cardiovascular, pulmonary edema will be mapped to respiratory, but they are kind of, they are basically the same thing. So FMQs basically don't really follow that hierarchy, which is actually an advantage, compared to just the MEDRA hierarchy. And here you can see the HLE does contain a lot of the preferred terms. So they're not always, not helpful, meaning, they are many times they are helpful. So for example, there's HLT of malignancy that can be very helpful. So we don't just limit to FMQs. We do look at other groupings as well, because, we can't have FMQ for everything, right? And so over time, we will keep on developing more and more FMQs, but there will always be another adverse event of interest where some of this other can be very helpful. So, thank you.
Thanks, Shally. That was very helpful. So I guess what I'd like to ask the group, it's come up a number of times, the issue of narrow versus broad. And the time that we spent working on broad had to have been at least triple the amount of time on narrow. Do you think that broad is useful? Is this the right sort of paradigm that one should have? Is there a more novel way of approaching this? Have you found broad to be a useful category in your own experience? Open that up to the entire panel.
Well, this is Barbara Hendrickson. Jen, I agree that the SMQs, especially the broad ones, have a lot of issues. It brings in a lot of noise, and it often is not very useful, I have to say. Since, I haven't actually used the broad FDA MEDRA queries, I can't say for sure how that will stack up with the broad SMQs. But I do really welcome, I should say, the effort to try to be more standardized across the divisions, because one of the things, that I think probably everybody in industry has encountered is that the approach to especially labeling in terms of the preferred term groupings, it really varies quite a bit among products, even in the same product class in the label. And also, what is requested sometimes by the divisions varies. And so having more standardization, I think is going to be a great positive for both the companies as well as healthcare prescribers, as they look at one label versus another label. And for example, injection site reactions, maybe one company contains only the preferred term injection site reaction in their calculation of a rate, whereas another company has a grouping of terms that could represent injection site reaction. So their rate looks much higher than another product of a similar class. And I think a lot of healthcare prescribers don't really understand MEDRA at all. I know I didn't before I came into industry. I didn't really know anything about MEDRA. And so, they don't really understand that, this grouping versus not grouping and how that's affecting the rates of different events in product labeling. And so, in that they really can't compare, the rates across different labels, really. because of some of this. So I think, trying to standardize some of this is really a good thing.
Right. I would say not that they don't understand Medra, they don't know it exists. It's not something that they have any clue.
Right.
I didn't when I was in private practice. And I don't know that they need to. I think it's part of our job to offload things that they don't really need to focus on. They have their attention distributed across a lot of issues. Greg, did you have any thoughts on broad category? Is there a more specific way to use broad? I know when I was creating broad categories, it wasn't infrequent where I was happy to have a place I thought it was a good term, and it just didn't fit in narrow, and I felt good about it. But I don't know that we could point to a lot of successes with broad, and I'd like to hear your experience.
Yeah, so defining safety topics of interest within a aggregate safety assessment planning process. At the beginning, when you're learning about some of these safety topics of interest, you have less certainty about what it is that you're looking at there. So the broad is generally used earlier. So a broader definition is generally used earlier. And then as your knowledge grows, hopefully that points to the more specific, the more narrow. Now, exactly how that's going to work with the FMQs, I mean, we haven't been able to actually use them yet. But in the past, what I've seen is you start with a broader definition, a wider net to catch more of the events, and then you look at them, and then as you understand, maybe you can distill down to the narrow, and some of these broader terms fall out, and so that's how I would kind of see it working in the future. So more for signaling, probably use the broader, but by the time you get ready to label, I think the narrow is going to be more useful.
Thank you. Ellis, I think if I know you, I think I know what your thoughts on broad are, but please share.
Yeah.
I think it's a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, between my queries and the FMQs, I probably ran 100 of these things and looked at them pretty carefully. I would guess if you took the approach of running the broad queries and using them as a first cut, so to speak, you in maybe 1 out of 15 or 20 drug applications, you might find something that you wouldn't have found if you just looked at the narrow. I mean, I just found the broad there were too many non-specific terms. So the noise obviously the danger is the noise drowns out the signal. And I think there was quite a bit of that. So I'm more of a proponent of focusing on the narrow for the FMQs and also the SM, standard meta queries. I just, somebody could easily run through, 50 or 100 adverse event data files and figure it out. It's a good project for somebody, I suspect, broad versus narrow. But my experience tells me just, spend your time on the narrow and you'll get 99.9% of what you need.
Although I would say now that these things are defined, I mean, that's the hard part, is coming up with a definition. So if we have these 104 standard FMQs that are looked at, right, you can present them very quickly with the narrow and the broad, and you can look at them both, and that provides a richer, fuller understanding of that medical concept, right? So that way we could be efficient. If we had to come up with all of these definitions ourselves every time, it would be very inefficient and certainly inconsistent.
I mean, what I used to do was I would run the queries, broad and narrow, and then my own, and I would run them in JUMP and dump them into a spreadsheet, and then just sort them, by absolute risk difference and relative risk difference, and you'd see what rises to the top and what, falls to the bottom. But so many times, I think every time when I had the broad and the narrow, in the same spreadsheet, and I would look at them, it was like the broad is just, this is not useful. Just so many times. So I would, rather than having a spreadsheet, with 500 terms on it, that's 500 queries, broad, narrow, etc. I'd rather have half of that myself. But again, you could go and as a, an experiment, one could look at this. I'm sure there would be rarely a signal you'd find with a broad that you would have completely missed with a narrow. But I suspect most of the time you'd find a narrow signal, which can allow you to say, okay, let's take a step back, also look at broad.
One other consideration with new technology that's becoming available, and as I mentioned before, Jeremy Wildfire is going to be talking about ISG, interactive safety graphics, in the next session. But this is a new idea. They're not just developing analytics for a multidisciplinary group. They have a multidisciplinary group developing the analytics for a multidisciplinary group to look at. And it's interactive. So you could look through all of these FMQs and you could use data visualization, and you can identify clusters, and you can drill down to patient level data. And they have, and I forget the exact term, it's a clinical workflow or something like that. So it formally incorporates this medical judgment in the process of looking at these things. And so that's for ongoing aggregate safety evaluation. But the Fuse data visualization team has demonstrated that you could actually use interactive safety analytics in a submission. It was done in a demonstration project, and it was well received. So moving forward, right, we have all of these elements that the FDA is putting out there now to help standardize how we look at certain terms and groupings and how we display them. And now with this technology to use interactive looks, and not just for our own purposes in companies developing our understanding, but when we communicate it to the FDA and other regulatory agencies and even other stakeholders, now we can do it more interactively, right? Not completely, just a data mining expedition here, but now we can really standardize it and explain how we're going to do it, but make it available. And I think that going forward in submissions, there's always questions. You submit everything and you think, wow, we told them everything about the safety. There's always more questions, right? But if you have an interactive package to look at all these things and we're all looking at it the same way, we'll be able to understand it together and make the review process more efficient.
Yeah, Scott, if I could just make one quick comment. I mean, I think the safety topics of interest, which are pre-specified, generally have really in-depth analyses done by teams. But I think some of the challenge is looking for other adverse reactions that may be in the midst of all this data that weren't pre-specified as safety topics of interest. And so, I think somebody who's very experienced can look through, with a medical background, can look through a SOC and PT table and maybe, pick out things that really need to be looked at in more depth. And certainly we tend to look at, in my area, any adverse event that's occurring in over 1% of the active treatment group and just seeing what those look like. But I think any tools that our statistics colleagues can come up with to try to help us better sort through all of that data to look for any novel safety signals that weren't pre-specified as safety topics of interest would be very helpful.
Very good. I was also curious to hear your thoughts on labeling of group terms, as far, not necessarily just FMQs, but just group terms, period. I've had some interesting conversations with other groups about whether one would even acknowledge that the grouping had been used, so that it would be to the reader, they wouldn't know that nausea or pulmonary edema, that term is actually representing 6 or 7 preferred terms. And so I guess I was surprised that was controversial, but I very much wanted to hear the panel's thoughts. Maybe you could start with Greg.
Well, I'm going to redirect this to Barbara. We had a conversation recently, and she was talking about the importance of understanding the medical concept when you come up with these FMQs or any grouping. So I think that that's really relevant here. So I would throw it to Barbara first.
Oh.
Well, I strongly agree with you, actually, Scott, that you should note if something appearing in the adverse reaction table is a group term. I mean, for those of us who are in safety across industry, that helps us tremendously understand, the product labeling across products that might be of a similar class, for example. So, and I think the idea that you have for the anxiety example that you showed, where you say that it's group terms that represent, I don't know the exact wording you have, but similar related terms. I think that's fairly clear to me. And, that anything that has the word in your example of anxiety in the preferred term, that would be included in that percentage. I think what happens sometimes, for example, like upper respiratory tract infection, sometimes the number of preferred terms that can constitute that group term are quite a few. And so you can't really logistically label all of them, in the footnote for the table. And so, you just say it's a group term, I think is appropriate to say it represents a group term. But I think, again, having these FDA metric queries, if they're standardized and you can understand what is potentially included in the upper respiratory tract infection group term across different product labels for us in industry, will be very helpful, because we are not always clear across products what is being included. So even if it's not all in the footnote, at least if we know from your FDA metric queries what you're recommending should be included as part of that grouping, I think that will be very helpful.
And I think there's a lot of information that is hard to quantify that is involved in the medical judgment. And I think that example about the Challenger disaster, right? There was important information that was not included in the decision-making process because it wasn't quantitative. But these FMQs are important ideas. They describe the medical concepts, and this is the way of clinical thinking, and this is going to be very useful for practitioners when they talk to their patients about these drugs. Right, we're going to be characterizing the important safety topics of interest that are going to make it understandable to the healthcare providers and their patients. So it's as a statistician, it's a little uncomfortable, right, dealing with non-quantitative information, but we got to find a way to work together so that we can organize it and describe it in a way that's useful for people.
I think this initiative will represent a sea change in terms of how the labeling's done, how drug applications are reviewed, because it will be I don't know whether you're going to require this or encourage it, but whatever, the change will come. And as Barbara said, the injection site reaction reported in a contemporary label could be very different from an injection site reaction reported, 10 years ago in somebody an isolated program. So the more I think about it, the more I would put an asterisk at the top of the adverse reactions table and say, well, or the lines that represent queries, and just say, these represent FDA adverse event queries. This was the September 2022 version of the query that was used to write this label. and have that online as a reference. And just do that, and you can update them, whenever you want, and have the labels updated. I mean, obviously the asterisk would refer to the, the more contemporary version of your queries, but I think that's how I would approach this.
Thanks,
Yeah, and
Alex.
I had to go off camera because my internet too is a little bit unstable, but I think that, again, your example where you had, I think, obsessive compulsive disorder or panic disorder, something that was captured under your anxiety query. But for me, if I saw anxiety in a adverse reaction table, I would not automatically think that that would include panic disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. So I think your inclination to want to call those out to a prescriber, that this is what you're including as part of the rate, I think is a good one for me as a physician, because I wouldn't automatically think that. Whereas if I had anxiety and anxiety aggravated, that would automatically, I would think those were grouped.
And getting back to that conversation we had earlier, so these FMQs, I think, are going to be very useful, and we have a list of terms, but I think it would be very beneficial if there was a description of each of these FMQs. What was the thought process that got us to this point here? What do we think we're really measuring here? What we're characterizing, right? And describe that medical concept so that people understand why something was included and maybe something else wasn't included. And then when a healthcare practitioner, again, is prescribing this drug and they know about the safety issue, they'll be able to characterize the exact nature of that issue to their patient and whether it's relevant or not. I think it'll help people understand what these things are that we're saying are associated with these drugs.
Yeah, I could just maybe add a little bit to say that our strategy was to, as best as we could, follow the ground rules that we had set for broad and narrow and for exclusion. And for any FMQ that didn't fully or couldn't fully be characterized by the ground rules, that we thought we needed to have some exception, or there's something about the FMQ that just didn't follow the pattern entirely of the ground rule, we have a comment. And probably at least half of the FMQs have this sort of comment describing in what ways we struggled to apply the ground rules. But it isn't for every FMQ. And that's the strategy that we used. Eric's been waiting quite patiently, and we've been talking about labeling. So as he's the associate director of the labeling team in OND, I'm very excited to hear his thoughts.
Oh, very interesting discussion. Just a couple of things with respect to labeling. We also received some questions in the Q&A about labeling. But firstly, as you know, according to the adverse reaction section of labeling guidance, we include a disclaimer in the beginning of the clinical trials experience subsection in the adverse reaction section, basically stating that really there's challenges of comparing the data presented below from other labeling. So that's a disclaimer, no matter whether it's before the presentation of the description of the studies that make up the safety database, that's prior, including demographics or important baseline disease characteristics to consider, the common adverse reaction table, and additional safety information. So that is a disclaimer prior to all information in that section. Number two, so great discussion, back to Barbara's comment about it would be helpful to include footnotes to distinguish between group terms and individual terms. Thank you, Barbara, for your comments. There are a lot of different ways to include additional information, let's say if it's anxiety. So one could include, after the common adverse reactions table, you can include additional tables focused on the specific adverse reaction of special interest with a different analysis. So that can always be done. The adverse reaction section of labeling guidance and the regulations talk about describing specific adverse reactions. You could talk about timing, who did it occur in. So that type of information can be also included in the adverse reaction section of labeling guidance. We also touched on, there was also some questions about oriented labeling towards clinicians. How are we orienting labeling towards clinicians? Well, several ways, so we do research into labeling. There was a published study about how healthcare practitioners interpret labeling, including information in the adverse reaction section of labeling. In this study of 70 healthcare practitioners, they were shown different methods for developing the warnings and precautions section and their findings. So input by that, public input. After we write a draft guidance, we read over those comments from academia, industry, other members of the public, and then prior to finalizing those comments, we consider those comments. There was another question about electronic labeling. The prescribing information is required to be included in the package. In addition, electronic labeling is required to be distributed. So electronic labeling is available. The question was with respect to the person's preference for distributing electronic labeling. Electronic labeling is available on many different websites such as FDA Label, Daily Med, also Drugs at FDA. And that kind of sums up several of the labeling related questions.
Thank you, Eric. That was very helpful. Any follow-up thoughts from any of the panel about issues related to labeling?
I have one. Scott, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the principles espoused in constructing these queries was that more severe manifestations of a more mild adverse event were included in the query. And I'm not sure that was made clear. And that, so when Barbara makes the comment, gee, I'm really surprised that a panic attack is included in anxiety. It's because a panic attack is would be a severe manifestation of anxiety, according to the psychiatrists we talked to. And that was that, and that principle still stands?
It's complicated. So the first thing you have to decide is it, certainly when we say we're presenting anxiety, we want to present every manifestation of anxiety. Now, those individual types of manifestations, they may not on their own warrant labeling, meaning you couldn't call it out because on its own, panic attack, there was only a very modest difference. And you looked at timing and other factors, and you said, this doesn't qualify on its own as an adverse reaction that we could justify labeling. But it is anxiety. It represents a form of anxiety. So it could add to the concept of anxiety while not being able to be called out individually on its own. You also bring up another important issue is we wouldn't want to bury, even though it's included in the concept of anxiety, well, what if it did, based on its incidence, comparison across arms, other related data, did warrant labeling as an adverse reaction on its own? We would want to very much make clear in the table, potentially in the footnote, but again, if it's more severe than the concept that it's been subsumed in the FMQ, we probably want to have it in the body of the table so that it's very clear. Because I think what may have been bringing up, and it's an important concept, is even though we're grouping these items, we certainly don't want to lose very important medical events. Think in terms of, say, hemorrhage an aortic rupture. You might say, well, there's this proportion of patients with hemorrhage, but if there is a substantial number with aortic rupture, you'd want to make that clear as well. Hemorrhage includes a whole host, obviously, of different severities. So it gets it gets fairly complicated. But the idea always is to try to relay in the clearest language possible what the safety issues are. I don't know, Barbara, did you? Is it just your camera started working, or did you have something to share?
No, I have some internet instability, so sometimes if it's starting to freeze, I go off camera. But I would agree with you that what I was trying to say before too was that if you have, say, anxiety, I mean, that doesn't necessarily convey to me the spectrum of severity that has been seen in the clinical trial program. So I think if there is some preferred term that's included in that grouping that a clinician would see as more severe, you know, and that's a judgment call, of course, but you know, that probably would be good in some way to reflect that in labeling. So, but it is a judgment call, you know, and I think I mentioned this before when I saw your initial slides, is just, you know, how do you decide what is clinically important and should be called out specifically somehow in the footnote or in the table versus ones that you can assume would just be underneath the group term and do not have to be specifically called out in the label. Yeah, so that's a judgment call. I agree, but I think it's worthwhile to think about that so people understand the spectrum of severity that's been seen.
Thank you, Barbara.
I mean,
Eric? I'm sorry, Alice.
I was going to say, well, I mean, even a panic attack is not necessarily, you know, severe. You can have a mild panic attack. I mean, so the way we've been dealing with this for years is we look at serious adverse events and sometimes severe adverse events separately from all adverse events. And so the queries, you know, you do the query that includes panic attacks and garden variety anxiety, and you do a separate one for the serious adverse events of anxiety. And that's kind of that. I mean, that's the simple way of dealing with it, you know.
Okay, thank you. Eric, did you have another comment? I saw you come on camera.
Just a comment. So, Barbara, I agree with you with respect to the judgment call about whether you would consider something that's clinically important and call it out in the footnotes. Obviously, if something's clinically significant, an adverse reaction or risk, we would include that in the warnings of the caution section in addition to the adverse reaction section. And clearly that would be highlighted by the description of the clinically significant adverse reaction or risk, who's at risk, potentially incidents if you have that, and then mitigation strategies. So there are other places in the labeling. So even if, let's say it's panic attack, and these were severe panic attacks, and it didn't make the table, the common adverse reaction table, you could list it in the adverse reaction section, and you could potentially include a warnings and precautions. So that information would not be lost. And potentially your decision, as others would state, is that maybe it was, as Ella said, it's greater incidence of severe and serious adverse reaction X. However, numerically, it didn't make the cutoff on the table. You're still not going to lose that information, and it can be represented in the labeling appropriate.
Thank you, Eric. Greg, you have the final comment.
Yeah, I just want to point out that when you think about really how we've done it before, there's greater than 20,000 preferred terms. And if you look at all of them, you're going to get some where there's an imbalance not favoring the experimental drug, right? Just due to random chance. And so now, if that's all you're looking at, and that's all you have to go on, then you think that there's something there, right? Or at least you have to put it in the label. Now this system where we're looking at it more holistically, right? Now we look at the context. We don't just look at individual events. We look at related events, right? And other associated safety information. So now we really understand what's going on. And we take something, and just to throw some numbers out, let's say there's 20 preferred terms that might be in the label, but now we can characterize that as 2 FMQs in a certain way, and maybe 3 or 4 other preferred terms, right? And that's a lot more understandable than 20 terms, or, you know, magnify that however much you have to, right? So I think it's really important. This is a good idea. A lot of smart, passionate people have been thinking about this for a long time, and this is the system that they've come up with. Now, there's a lot of changes, right? And that's intimidating. But I think we should look forward, say like 5 years, right? In 5 years, this or something very similar to this is going to be implemented, and it's going to be successful, and it's going to be sustainable. So I think instead of looking forward, looking at all these changes ahead of us, we should look all the way ahead and say, this is going to be successful. And then think back, how did we get there? Because this is a really good idea.
Thank you. We really should. That's a wonderful final comment. We should wrap up now. And I just want to thank all the panelists for such an excellent conversation, and clearly a lot of enthusiasm and interest, because we went over, even though we started early. So that was very informative, and I appreciate all of your thoughts.